true, scary stories. The Purple Lady. I grew up in New York, and my family has a vacation house in Albany that we go to whenever we have free time. I don't go there much anymore because I'm in my 20s and I'm busier with work. Also, I have some bad memories of the house, so I prefer not to sleep there. The house is big and really beautiful. It's by a lake and it was actually a new build, so it's updated. I never liked it as a kid because of the things that I saw though. During the day the house was cool. Outside was nice and big, and sometimes my brother and I would play in the lake. At night, things would get really quiet, and the rooms didn't feel right. My brother and I would hear tapping on the walls, see flashes of light out of the corners of our eyes, and sometimes smell dirt. I hated that smell. When we smelled the dirt, we would see a girl, maybe late teens, in the hall by our room. She didn't seem to notice we were there. She just ignored us and kept walking around. She never came really close to us, never said anything. She just walked around, her face purple. The craziest memories I have are of the dirt smell, the silent rooms, and her just walking around. When my brother and I got a little older, we tried to see if anyone died on the land or the lake, but we couldn't find anything. I do think someone suffocated or drowned in the lake because of the way she looked. I don't really like going back to the house, but my brother goes. He and I both haven't seen her since we were little, about 13 or so, but whenever we're there, we both agree that we smell dirt at night. If anyone lives in Albany and has any info or history of the area, please let me know. I can give the area of Albany where the house is. I'd like to see if there was anything connected to the area. Haunted House. When I was around 21, I got divorced from my son's father and moved back home. Me and my son, who was around 15 months old at the time, didn't have any space there, so I was looking to move out as soon as possible. My best friend's sister just rented a house and was looking for a roommate, so long story short, we ended up moving in with her and her 5-year-old daughter. Everything was good at first, then little things would start happening, like the lights being on when I thought I turned them off, the washing machine lid being up even though I swore I closed it. Then one day, I came home from work and my roommate's prayer beads were in the mailbox. I asked her why she put them there, and she said she didn't, but maybe her daughter somehow did. So, some time passes with these odd occurrences, and one night we decide to go out. My son is with his dad, and she calls her cousin to come over and babysit her daughter. We're telling him about all the strange things that we've noticed, and he said something about not being scared of ghosts. Right as he said that, a glass that was on the bookshelf flew across the room and hit him. So we freak out because we are broke young single moms who don't want to go back home, and we kind of just push it out of our minds. We then decided to get 2 puppies for our kids. You may think I'm lying, but they never grew an inch while we were there. Also, there would be magnets in the sink for no reason. Then things started to escalate fast. One weekend, when the kids were at their father's house, me and my roommate decided to clean the kids' playroom, as it was a wreck. The next morning, it was a disaster again, even though the kids were gone for the weekend. At this point, I was scared to go home. One night I was in bed, and she was in hers. Then we heard knocking on the windows outside. We both had toxic exes and thought it might be one of them, so we called the police. They came out and they said it didn't look like anyone had been there. We decided it was time to move out. As much as I didn't want to, I had to move back home when the kids started to get hurt. My roommate's daughter cut herself on a mirror, and my son fell out of a chair and busted his face. We also got really bad nosebleeds out of nowhere. While we were moving, a huge mirror that was anchored into the wall fell and injured my back. A lot of things happened in that house. The old man that lived across the street told us no one ever lived there for very long. Now I know why. The Ring. When I was a teenager, my dad and stepmom decided we were going to go to Tennessee to meet her family. She had come into some money from some lawsuit, so she had bought my dad some kind of fancy ring. The only issue was that it was a little too big, but he wore it up there so she could show her mom the new wedding sets. My dad is really cheap, so we stayed in the most shitty hotel. The first morning we were there, I took a shower and it flooded the bathroom, so we had to move rooms. When we got to my step-grandmother's house, my dad noticed his ring wasn't on his finger. He figured he must have lost it when he was sleeping. He asked the hotel manager and he said no one found it. My dad figured the housekeeper found it and just kept it. Side note, my dad is a complete neat freak. So before we left, all the beds had to be made and the house had to be spotless. We got home late. It was a long drive, so as soon as we got home, my stepmom pulled back the covers of their bed and screamed. Right in the center of the bed was the ring. It was dented all to hell and back. I get goosebumps remembering this story. We have no idea how it got there. He definitely had it on when we left to go to Tennessee. A rattle at the door. This happened around 2015 when I, a 25-year-old female, was alone in my upstairs apartment with my normally very calm, quiet, older cattle dog. I was sitting on the couch against the wall with the front door to my immediate left, on the same wall that the couch was up against, so I could look to my left, and the doorknob was an arm's length and in clear view. I was scrolling on my phone through creepypastas and urban legends, trying to find a good story that would really give me the chills. My dog was sleeping soundly at my feet. For the life of me, I cannot find the story that I had come across when a chill ran down my spine. I heard something and looked over to see the doorknob rattling hard. I jumped up so fast and looked around to notice nothing else was shaking. Still trying to process what was happening, I see my dog standing in front of the door, hair on his back standing straight up, teeth bared and growling. I had never seen him act like that before, but his face looked confused. The doorknob continued to rattle loudly. Not like someone was turning it from outside, but instead shaking it very fast. I could physically see it shaking from a few feet away. It seemed to last minutes, but I'm sure the whole thing happened within 60 seconds. Being freaked out, I quickly, and without thinking, closed out the story on my phone, and the rattling stopped. My dog and I looked at each other and exchanged confused glances. I stood there for a moment with my dog at my side and told myself I was overreacting and just jumpy because I had been reading all those scary stories. I took a deep breath and said, "Hello?" No answer. I felt silly. Maybe my now ex was home early and just trying to get inside in a hurry. I reached for the doorknob, unlocked it, and opened the door. As the door opened, I took a step outside and leaned halfway out, looking around. Nothing. The stairs leading down were empty to my left along the wall, and there was just a wall to my right with no one in sight. To this day, I don't know what caused the rattling. That day, I opted out of my scary story search and instead curled up on the couch with my dog and binge-watched episodes of Friends. I never had any more experiences in that apartment after that. You're probably wondering what the story was that I came across before the rattling started. I didn't get the chance to start reading it, but I remember it being something about a Japanese war nurse. I'm not even sure if it's actually related, but I'd love to hear your opinions either way. I've tried looking for it again, but no luck. If anyone thinks they may know what it was and why this happened, I'm open to solving this case once and for all. I heard my own voice, but it wasn't me. Hello, I'm 23 and in college. I live in a small college town in a 2-bedroom apartment by myself. This was about 2 weeks ago. I was taking the trash to my dumpster at my complex, which wasn't too far. I didn't lock the door, and I know for sure I didn't because I have a camera. I was carrying heavy furniture, so I know I wouldn't have been able to lock it. When I returned from the trash, I heard myself complaining on the other side of the door. When I realized it was my voice, I froze in fear for about 10 seconds. I tried to open my door, but it was locked, and the voice was gone as soon as I put my hand on the door. I say I was complaining because that's the closest thing I can refer to in the way I was speaking, as the voice was upset and loud. I've thought about what this could have been over and over again. I checked my camera, which picked up my every move in the moment and usually picks up sound, but nothing was there. My friend said maybe it could have been some sort of skinwalker or some kind of glitch in the Matrix. Any ideas or similar instances? Thanks. For a decade, I was a paranormal tour guide at an infamous location. The Trans-Albany Lunatic Asylum, formerly known as Weston State Hospital, is a Kirkbride building that housed the mentally ill from 1864 to 1994. In 2007, it was privately purchased and has become a museum, historic location, and ghost hunting spot. It has a most unpleasant and dark history that I've regaled to thousands of people, and it pains me to be an expert on the subject. In 2021, I retired from my position as a guide and ghost hunt event manager under severe burnout. After all that I experienced there, it solidified in my mind that paranormal things that defy rational explanation do indeed happen, and certain phenomena are absolutely real, EVPs included. It's almost October, and I'm feeling a little spooky. So here are a couple of strange things I experienced in my time there. One evening while training for the job, I was on the first floor with a couple of coworkers while everyone else was touring upstairs. We were just kind of killing time, quietly observing the area. Light from outside was coming in through the windows, casting on the inner hall's wall. In that light, I watched the perfect silhouette of a man from head to hip walk through the light from left to right. I said something about it, and the three of us watched as an arm and hand moved into the light from the right side. I immediately ran into the room and began looking out of that window for someone outside. There was no one there at that time. The realization that from the ground to the bottom of the window is about 7 feet didn't even occur to me. I will never forget the crisp, clear silhouette shape for as long as I live. We would run experiments with a spirit box, which rapidly scans radio frequencies and is believed to be a communication device. One person would use one with noise-canceling earbuds. All they're able to hear is the radio static and blips of a few random stations. When they hear a word or phrase, they are to say it out loud. I always liked this role in the experiment. One evening, My coworker and I ran one of these experiments in a notorious room where a murder in 1987 took place. For 10 minutes, I sat and listened to nothing but radio static through the spirit box. No blips of radio, nothing except static. I was starting to get bored when I heard a woman's voice say, "Evil." So I spoke up and repeated the word. Next thing I know, my coworker is shining her flashlight in my face to get my attention. I pull out the earbud, and she was practically frantic, saying, "It's time to go." So we haul ass out of that room, down the hall, down the next hall to the center section before she would even tell me what happened. While I was hearing nothing but static, she said she kept hearing what sounded like someone shuffling their feet and walking around just outside of the door. She said she spoke up and asked, "Whoever is out in the hallway, are you nice?" That was when I spoke out and said, "Evil." Another time, late one night, we figured it would be cool to see what would happen if we shut all the doors of the ward. One of the doors, as I was closing it, the knob twisted in my hand and was forcibly closed. I stood there for several moments opening and closing that door, trying to replicate what happened, trying to explain it. Finally, the person with me said, "What the hell are you doing?" It was so weird. I'd never felt an invisible force like that before. Another time, I had 3 people spend the night, and they had thermal imaging video. They set it up, pointing down the hall where we could all watch on a tablet. We thought it would be interesting to leave a device at the far end of the hall that would emit an alarm if the field around it was disturbed. As one of the guys walked down the hall to put it there, we could see his form on thermal imaging, clearly human-shaped in color, representing heat and warmth. When he walked by one of those doorways about a quarter of the way down the ward, the shape of a head, neck, and shoulders of a person in color, indicating cooler temperatures, leaned out as he walked by, like someone popped out of the room for a second to check him out. I've never seen anything like that and won't forget it anytime soon. I would give anything for a copy of that footage. That happened a lot. A guest capturing something strange and not sending a copy to us. I'll end this long-winded Reddit post with something that absolutely changed me and that I still don't understand. I remember the exact night and time of these occurrences. That's how profound and somewhat unsettling they were. June 3rd and June 4th of 2017, 3:40 a.m. After an hour or so of hearing a female's voice, one instance even sounded like they said my name, as well as banging around, footsteps, literally running sounds on that hardwood floor toward us, I sat quietly on the floor with a group. I started to feel dizzy, lightheaded, and gross. I told myself it was just my imagination and that I'd be fine. A few minutes later, I started to feel this intense burning sensation on my lower back, just to the right of my spine. Again, I told myself it was all just my imagination. The burning sensation kept amping up, getting worse and worse. I told myself that I didn't want to be that guy and say anything in front of these people, you know? Finally, it got to the point where I had to say something. I asked my coworker with us if there was anything there. She was horrified. There, on my lower back, just to the right of my spine, was a mark that looked like a burn or an abrasion about 3 to 4 inches long and about 1 inch wide. Now, I'd seen other such claims made by visitors of scratch marks and the like, and the marks were always gone within an hour at most. I had visible markings on my back for almost a week. To this very day, I often feel weird, sometimes chilled, sometimes like a skin soreness, especially when I think on the experience. June 4th, I went back again. Same part of the building, same time of night. I noticed that my voice recorder ran out of memory, so I'm holding it in my right hand, using the flashlight in my left, so I could see what I was doing. Suddenly, I feel a burning sensation on the underside of my right forearm, then shifted my flashlight to it. The person beside me and I watched as 3 welts began to appear down my arm. Needless to say, it blew my mind. It's one thing to see marks like that. It's another to watch it as it happens on your own skin. Like the majority of instances I've heard about, those marks were gone within 10 to 15 minutes. No lasting effects. Scared would be the wrong word, but I have none to describe my frame of mind around those events. I took a week off from work after that to try and process it all, and was nervous being in that hallway for the rest of that summer. Like I said, I still don't know what to think or believe. I've got enough stories of experiences to probably fill a book, but I'll leave you with those for now. I will add a final note about how constantly poking around in the dark and talking about past true horrors of human experience day in and day out truly takes its toll, spiritually and emotionally. Since my resignation, my mental health and overall level of happiness has greatly improved. I used to tell people for a while afterwards that it felt like I'd gotten out of a toxic relationship with that place. My grandfather's story. When I was younger, I can always remember my dad telling me that my grandfather, his dad, had a terrifying experience when he was younger. But my dad couldn't remember the story properly to tell me, so I said I'll ask him. My dad said never to ask him as it still shakes him up. Well, one night, me and my grandfather were telling ghost stories. He had a few beers that night, and he started to tell me that story. He said he has only ever told a handful of people, and he will only tell it to someone once. When my grandfather was younger, around 10 to 12, he lived in a small village outside of town where he went to school. He would get home every Friday night and go to help an elderly woman who lived in the village look after her garden and do small jobs around her house. She didn't have any family or children, so my grandfather and his parents looked after her. So he gets off the bus and heads to the old lady's house. He unlocks the shed and gets out the old push lawnmower and begins to do the grass. Looking in through the living room window, he sees the old lady who smiles and waves. After my grandfather had finished cutting the grass, he puts everything away and knocks on the door to collect his pay. The old lady slides the money and a hard candy out of the mail flap on the door and says, "Sorry, I'm not feeling too well, but here's your money." So my grandfather says, "Thank you very much," and she replies, "You're welcome, good lad." My grandfather returns home and his mother and father are sitting in the kitchen. They tell him to take a seat and they proceed to say, "We have something to tell you, but you probably already know. The old lady we look after, she died this morning. That's why she isn't at home and you weren't paid." My grandfather replies, telling them they are wrong because he had just spoken with her and saw her through the window. They obviously don't believe him until he pulls out the money and the hard candy from his pocket. They all freak out and go to the house where they find all the doors and windows locked and no one inside. As they are walking away, my grandfather turns around, and there she is, standing in the doorway, waving. Nobody believed him, and he was so scared and confused. This sent chills down my spine when he told me. He shouted, "I know I spoke to her, and I definitely saw her." And to this day, he still won't look at the house she lived in, just in case she's standing there, waving. Working in creepy places. I have worked in my fair share of creepy places, but this one takes the top spot. The best way to describe it is a mansion from the 1800s. The place is huge and very creepy. The sort of place where you don't want to be alone in. We were doing some renovations in the building as it was being made into a place for the public to be taken around on tours. And one thing we had to do was block off a doorway that went into an attic space that was very unsafe. Inside the attic space, there was a huge circular glass window that you could see the main parking area. All the while we were there, we all felt like we were being watched, and occasionally we would hear a bang from the attic space. We assumed it was coming from another part of the building, as there wasn't anything in there that could fall over, and we were blocking up the only way into it. We completed the job and loaded our tools into the truck. As we were leaving, I looked up to the building, and there was a woman dressed all in white, waving to us. So all three of us waved back, before realizing she was standing dead center in front of the circular window in the attic we had just closed off. We all freaked out and looked back up to see no one there. Paranormal encounter working for Google Earth. I got a temp job with Google driving one of those vehicles with a mounted 360-degree camera system. It was a fun job. I was tasked with recording highways, streets, and sometimes off-beaten paths in the middle of nowhere. I was assigned a company vehicle and I worked as a one-man unit. They paid for gas, hotel, and I got per diem for food. The pay was about $7,000 per month, before taxes. 1099 employee with no benefits though. My car was my office, and I would work 5 10-hour days weekly. I wouldn't have any human interaction for days, and it was a lonely job, but I enjoyed all the sightseeing adventures. The job was easy, but it required a lot of multitasking. You had a computer inside your car, had to navigate the road, and manipulate the camera system mounted on the roof. The job brought me to a small town somewhere north of Marysville, California. It was a quiet town and had a nice countryside vibe to it. I was finishing up my shift before my weekend, and I decided to take a shortcut by driving down the dirt road which I thought connected to the highway. I really regretted doing that. It was 5 p.m. in the evening in the middle of July, so the sun was still out. Due to the heavy foliage and overgrown trees, the path I drove was really dark and creepy. The forest made for a scene out of a horror movie. I put my headlights on just so I had better vision. As I was making a sharp turn on this downhill slope, I observed my headlights reflecting on a yellow dead-end sign. Luckily, there was plenty of room for me to do a U-turn safely. This part of the dirt road was the darkest part of the forest, with only small patches of sunlight penetrating through the canopy from the overgrown trees above. Once my car repositioned to exit the area, I looked in my rearview mirror and I noticed someone standing there behind the dead-end sign. It looked like a kid, maybe 13 years of age. He had one of those bowl-cut haircuts and wore dark-colored raggedy clothing. His face was pale and he had that 1,000-yard stare. I could feel his gaze locked towards my direction. He had no facial expression, did not blink, and stood frozen in place. I felt I should check on him and ask if he was okay. I rolled down my window and reversed my car closer to where the kid was standing. Once I saw the brake lights reflect off the yellow dead-end sign, I parked my car. I was expecting for him to come to my driver's side window, but the kid never came. I looked into my rearview mirror and he was gone. I didn't even hear any footsteps or the sound of twigs snapping. If the kid left, he must have been a trained ninja. The forest was eerily silent. The only sound that stood out was the engine from my car. I drove away slowly and egressed up that hill. As I came within 100 yards eyesight of the main road, I saw the same-looking kid walking about 50 yards in front of me. It's possible it could have been someone else, but the dark-colored shirt, ragged jeans, and physical stature resembled the kid from earlier. His back was exposed to me. I couldn't make out his hairstyle or skin complexion from that distance. He walked away from the forest onto the main road and walked eastbound. I waited until he was out of sight before I exited the forest and drove the opposite direction. I was so frightened I didn't even bother to check the rearview mirror. I redlined the hell out of there and booked it for dear life. Our cameras worked via LiDAR system and automatically recorded 360-degree panoramic photographs while the car was in motion. At the time of the encounter, my camera was recording. Therefore, I suspected the kid was likely captured in one of the images. I reviewed the photos from where I made the U-turn at the dead-end sign. Nothing. No kid, no shadow, not even a silhouette of a person of any form. The only photo captured was the yellow dead-end sign, the overgrown trees in the background, and dust particles from me driving on the dirt road. I reviewed the same recording from the second sighting of the kid upon my exit. Nothing. I had zero evidence of any person being captured in any of my recordings. Don't know if it was due to the lack of sleep, being dehydrated, or my eyes playing tricks with me, but I'm pretty sure I saw a ghost. Stalked by a psycho on a summer camping trip. I've told this story probably over 100 times, and despite being the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, I've come to appreciate that it makes for a great story, so I figure I'll share it with you all here. I should start by saying that I always hated going camping. My parents sent me to summer camp every year in Colorado, which involved at least one camping trip into the woods. Despite the brevity of these trips, I always resented them. The heavy bag, the lack of toilets, the spiders that always found their way into my tent. When I turned 16 and became a camp counselor in training, my distaste for the whole experience briefly changed. At that age, we were only a few years older than the oldest campers, but we were given considerable leeway in what we were allowed to do. Most nights, we would have to stay in the cabin with our campers, but it was rumored that the camping trip was a time where the counselors in training would get drunk, smoke weed, and hook up with each other after everyone else went to sleep. What I didn't know, however, was that the events of that camping trip would dissuade me from ever going camping in the woods again. The trip began as any other. Altogether, there were around 30 people on the trip. 4 counselors in training, 4 counselors, and around 20 or so boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 14, walking in a single file line up and down the various trails. You could hardly hear any sounds of nature over the conversations and laughter. Several hours went by and we made our way through a dense marshy area and up a steep incline populated with evergreens and aspens. I wasn't the most athletic kid, so it was around this point that I found myself at the back of the line with one of the other counselors in training, Jordan, as well as 2 campers who were also struggling to keep up. The 4 of us started chatting, and in our distracted state, we began to fall more and more behind the rest of the campers until the last of them faded out of view around a bend about 50 feet up the way. Unconcerned, we kept walking at the same slow pace, but after 30 minutes or so, the trail started to level off and I began to feel increasingly anxious. Not only had the rest of the group disappeared ahead of us, but we had entered a stretch of completely dead evergreens, half of which looked scorched by a wildfire and the other half appeared to have been killed by a disease. The eeriness of the landscape was punctuated by a small derelict cabin sitting in the middle of the scorched forest, but seemingly untouched by the fire that must have spread throughout the area. We were so enraptured by the scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig broke behind us. Jordan and I started laughing a bit, but we quickly stopped when we turned to look at where the sound had come from. Not 20 feet behind us was a haggard-looking man with a messy nest of black hair and a long black beard slowly making his way up the trail with his eyes locked on us. He didn't appear to have any hiking supplies on him, and we had no idea how long he had been walking behind us. Being young, we were naturally pretty freaked out, but Jordan managed to give the guy a slight wave before saying to the rest of us, "Come on, let's speed up and get back with the rest of the group." As we turned to continue our way up the path, the man mumbled a question that was hard to hear, and I was shocked when Jordan turned around to ask the man to repeat himself. The man muttered again, slightly louder, "Going camping?" Jordan answered the man that yes, we are going camping, to which the man smiled slightly before stating in a creepy and ominous voice, "Better be careful." We nodded and gave a half-hearted thank you before continuing on to try to find the rest of the group, this time with a much faster pace. Although the man had been walking up the same trail as us when we saw him, he didn't continue, but instead just stood there in the middle of the trail, watching us as we made our way up the path and disappeared from his view. Finally, we managed to catch up to the rest of the group, who had been waiting for us, and we told the adult counselors about our interaction with the man. They just shrugged it off, telling us that the guy probably lived in the cabin and just wanted to know what we were doing near his property. Still, I felt unnerved by the encounter, and when we finally arrived at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow followed us. Eventually, though, I put it out of my mind and managed to enjoy myself a bit. Everyone else had gone to bed, and Jordan and the other counselors in training from the boys' cabin had brought 2 warm mic harders that they had stolen from the counselors' quarters, and I took out a joint I had stashed away for this exact occasion. To avoid getting in trouble, we decided to hike out into the woods a bit to smoke the joint, and we made our way to the edge of the river where we had washed our pots and pans earlier in the day. The spot was eerily silent, and the thought of the man from earlier kept popping into my head. Assuming that I was cold, not anxious, Jordan gave me his blue hoodie, and this prompted one of the other girls to suggest that we switch tents for the night, so I could sleep in the same tent with him, and she could sleep in the same tent as the other boy. I had absolutely no problem with this, and after smoking the joint, we made our way back to our tents, which were pitched slightly away from the others, and we discreetly sipped on the Mike's Harders while telling scary camping stories. Some time passed, and one of the boys was in the middle of telling a rather muddled story that he was clearly making up on the spot, when he suddenly stopped. In the silence, we could hear what sounded like footsteps crunching on pine needles about 40 feet away, near one of the other campers' tents. As we strained to listen to what was going on, the noises stopped, and even though we assumed it was just one of the campers getting up to go to the bathroom, being stoned and hopped up from the scary stories, we decided to call it a night and go hide in our tents. Jordan followed suit, and we awkwardly made out before eventually going to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but it must have been quite late when I suddenly woke up to the distinct sounds of footsteps walking around near my tent. Shot with adrenaline, I tried to lay as still as possible and quiet my breathing. From the sound, it was apparent that someone was less than 3 feet away from my tent, seemingly pacing back and forth. I turned to wake up Jordan, but I was immediately put at ease when I saw that he wasn't next to me. Assuming Jordan was the one I had been hearing, I closed my eyes and I was just beginning to drift back to sleep when I heard the tent unzip. I felt Jordan lie down next to me, and after a few moments he put his arms around me and began to spoon me. After nearly drifting off to sleep again, I realized that I had to go to the bathroom and muttered something about having to go pee before beginning to unzip my sleeping bag. Seemingly annoyed by the noise, Jordan lazily turned over, pulling his hoodie up over his head before going still again. Quietly, so as not to wake him, I unzipped the tent and quickly scanned the campsite for movement. Comforting myself that Jordan had just gone pee and was fine, I put my shoes on and began making the trek across our campsite to the designated pee zone. I had just made it to the area and pulled my pants down when I heard rustling coming from the campsite, as if someone was rummaging through our supplies and bags. Still slightly drunk, I tried to pull my pants up, and in my haste, I lost my balance and tried to catch myself on a branch that made a loud snapping noise when I grabbed it. I tried to gather myself as quietly as I could, but when I finally managed to look up, I could see that there was a figure making its way across our campsite in my direction. Before I could even think, I was blinded by the bright light of a flashlight shining directly in my eyes, and the light was getting bigger, so whoever it was, they were coming toward me. Frozen and panicked, the figure got 10 feet away from me before I heard Jordan's voice say, "Sorry, it's just me." I breathed a sigh of relief, but then Jordan asked me something that really confused me. "Have you seen my blue hoodie? I know you gave it back to me, but I think one of the campers might have stolen it from my bag while I was sleeping." After a brief pause, I managed to stutter out, "But you were just wearing it when you got back in the tent." What he said next made my blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" he said. "It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even went down there to see if I had left it by accident, but after I couldn't find it, I thought I'd check the boys' bags, and that's when I saw you." My confusion quickly turned to sheer terror as I realized the man who got into the tent with me just moments prior hadn't been Jordan. Sensing that something was wrong, Jordan asked me what happened, and I managed to get out that whoever stole his hoodie was sleeping in our tent. Not believing me, Jordan insisted on walking back to the tent to check it out. As slowly and quietly as possible, we made our way to the side of the tent, and when Jordan flipped on his flashlight and shined it through the nylon lining, he let out a high-pitched scream. We could both see the clear outline of a man's shadow lying still inside our tent. What happened next is a bit of a blur, but we ran to the pod of tents on the other side of the campground where the older counselors were sleeping and frantically unzipped their tent and started yelling for them to come out and that there was a man in our tent. I remember panic setting in as our counselors slowly and groggily woke up, but after a bit of more frantic yelling, they finally managed to understand the severity of the situation when a commotion broke out on the other side of the camp near our tent. By the time they ran to the scene, however, they only found an unzipped tent and a bunch of our things littered on the ground that the man had apparently knocked over or thrown during his escape. After that, we heard the counselors radio back down to the camp to call the police, and we could tell that they were just as scared as we were. I don't think any of us slept after that. Luckily, we only had to wait a few hours for the sun to come up, and by that time, a few of the other counselors had arrived with guns to escort us back to camp. On our way back down, one of the campers found Jordan's sweater tied around one of the trees on the path like some sort of marker. Needless to say, he didn't want the hoodie back, and we just left it there. To this day, I can't say for certain that the man in the tent was the same guy that we ran into earlier on the trail, but his face, in that night, still haunt me.